Hi, I'm James Wise, and welcome to What's Next, a series of interviews with the founders of technology companies taking on some of the biggest challenges we face as a society today. Today we're talking to Dr. James Field, the founder and CEO of LabGenius, a business on a mission to combine human and machine learning capabilities to improve not just human health, but the very nature of how we do scientific research. In this episode, we talk about James's journey from academia as a PhD at Imperial through to starting his business, getting the team up and going, raising funding, and shipping that first product. We talk about how advances in artificial intelligence, machine learning, CPU, GPU, and synthetic biology are advancing his own capabilities at LabGenius and his mission for the company over the next decade. Enjoy. James Field, welcome to What's Next, and thank you so much for making time today. It's very kind of you to come. So the purpose of this series is to talk about technology companies which are tackling some of the biggest challenges we face today. And there are probably fewer bigger challenges. They're not just taking on human health, but also in a way the nature of scientific research itself, which I think is part of what LabGenius has set out to do, which is an incredible and ambitious goal. Perhaps the right starting point then is to talk a little bit about LabGenius and unpack that mission that you started the business around.
Absolutely, and thanks very much for having me on the show. So I started out working in the field of synthetic biology when I was doing my PhD, and one of the things that really struck me at that point is we have, on the one hand, this incredibly elegant solution for engineering biological matter, biological products, and that's evolution. And on the other hand, you've got rational design, the process by which, as a human, you try and look at how a molecule or a biological system works and try and unpick it. And it felt like there were kind of inherent limitations for both. And really what we're trying to do at LabGenius is bring the very best of human ingenuity with machine intelligence to accelerate the discovery of novel, in this case, therapeutic antibodies.
And when you set out on that journey, I think we first met sort of end of 2017, early 2018, when you started to get the business going. Was this your background? Was this something you've been working on for decades and had as a vision from your earliest childhood or academic days, or is this an evolving idea that you've had that you wanted to work on?
I think for so many founders, building a company is really an extension of themselves, and it's a vehicle through which they can pursue something that's really integral to them and a core passion. And for me, it was definitely that as a main driver. So I've always loved and been passionate about biology. But the big inflection moment or change in my own trajectory came when I got to the end of my undergraduate degree. So I was studying microbiology at Imperial. And up to that point, biology had really just been a descriptive subject, that process of trying to learn as much around biological systems as possible. But at the end of my undergraduate, I discovered there was this thing called synthetic biology. And this is a discipline where you can start to actually create novel biological systems and apply engineering approaches to that. And really, that's what set me on this journey of understanding how we can really program and engineer biology to create new important therapeutics.
In the last year, I think there's been this incredible breadth of new tools released, driven by generative AI, right? Obviously, everyone's aware of ChatGPT, but there's been a bunch of new releases, whether it's AlphaFold or other tools. How's that changed what you're doing at LabGenius?
I think it's really interesting to think around what is the fundamental unlock that's creating all of this change? And it's the digitization of biology. Any of these modeling approaches, whether you're taking generative methods, Bayesian optimization, et cetera, they're all data hungry. And the big wave of innovation that we're really seeing is the ability to both read and write biological systems, to write new synthetic DNA at ever cheaper prices, to read through sequencing, and to biologically interrogate these complex mechanisms and systems through analytical equipment. And it's that whole digitization of biology through this confluence of several different technologies together, automation, synthetic biology, computation, that is setting the groundwork and the fundamental opportunity for then applying the intelligence layer on top of that. And I think it's through the application of intelligence on these digitized biological systems that we have the opportunity and potential to drive tremendous outcome from a patient value perspective.
And it's kind of interesting to reflect on the fact that it's not been some big chemical or biological breakthrough that's driven this. Actually, it's breakthroughs in chips and compute and data. It's the software and sort of hardware side of computers, which has really driven, I guess, to some degree, advancements in what you're seeing now in biology.
I think it's confluence. Like that for me is the key piece, because to create this moment, this kind of crucible of innovation, it's really bringing together not only the software point and the hardware point, it's also integrating that with the advances that we've seen on the molecular biology side as well. And I think there is often this kind of oversimplification or desire for a narrative where we can just point at one single thing that's tipped the balance. But the reality is, and the nuance here, is its confluence. It's bringing together all of those different exponential technologies together. And at that interface, in that crucible, we're seeing the opportunity for innovation.
And by hard work and some fortune, you found yourself at the right time in the right place.
I hope so.
But going back to that starting period, your PhD, I believe, is in synthetic materials rather than synthetic biology. Is that right?
So my PhD was actually on targeted drug discovery, and it's really around engineering novel protein components to differentiate between healthy and diseased cells.
And right now, I think there's a lot of debate about the value of further education, and particularly university education and PhDs when it comes to starting a business, right? There's many schools of thought around this. Was that experience really integral in your journey to start LabGenius?
So I had quite an unusual experience for my PhD. I think for most people, when they start a PhD, they're working in a kind of quite tightly predefined area of research. For myself, I had these incredible PhD profs who said, James, you've got 4 years to go and explore and really actually come up with a project that you want to do and architect that from the beginning. And so actually that process of doing the PhD taught me not only about how to really kind of design a research project from scratch, but also I had the challenge of getting aspects of it funded. So I actually started to write grant applications to charities and so on and so forth to actually get the funding to do some of the work itself. So in some ways, that was actually part of this entrepreneurial training of how do you, not only work on the deep tech side, but also finance the innovation as well.
And do you think that's a relatively unique experience? Or do you think that's true for a lot of PhD researchers, that they get that kind of experience of, not just getting really deep into a problem, but in a way, it sounds almost like a startup incubator, getting those first experiences of what it's like setting up a business, going out to raise funding, understanding maybe the kind of team you need to build around yourself to get going?
I think it's quite particular to the area of synthetic biology. And really that's because as a discipline, synthetic biology is an applications-focused subject. So really you're not, for many people, the sole driver isn't to understand some kind of deep biological truth. It's more around how do I build something useful. And one of the things I've observed, certainly in the UK, is a lot of the synthetic biology PhD programs really do have that strong application focus of trying to understand what's the need of the system or product that you're trying to build, and then how could that translate through afterwards. And indeed, I think a lot of the doctoral programs that have been set up actually are tightly integrated with incubators that you can then sort of transition into.
I mean, certainly Imperial's got a very rich history in doing that and gets a lot of credit for it, I think, rightly so. And not every university in the UK or across the world has taken the same steps Imperial has, I think, to support that kind of entrepreneurial nature. I mean, interestingly enough, as we do this series of interviews, I think of the 10 founders that we're interviewing in the first series, 8 of them do have PhDs, which are directly related to what they were building. So clearly there's a link there. But this is maybe over a decade ago since you completed your PhD. Do you still think that link's there? Do you think for someone to take on a really deep technical challenge today and build a business around it that you need to have that kind of wealth of research experience?
I think there are different aspects to this. Certainly, I think what a PhD teaches you, at least if you're doing wet lab work, is incredible resilience. If you're working in the lab, more often than not, your experiments fail. And that kind of constant experience of getting kicked in the gut and then just having to get up and try again and again and again is actually something that I think really serves founders well, because the startup experience is pretty grueling. I think something that it doesn't really prepare you for is that transition from going from a deep tech innovator to somebody who's actually trying to build and scale a business. I think the skill set there is actually very different. I think as LabGenius has grown, one of the things that I've observed is my role's transition from initially being somebody who's really at the forefront of the technology and working at the bench to somebody who's more trying to think around organizational engineering, management, financing, et cetera. And it's a different skill set. And that's certainly a transition that the PhD doesn't prepare you for.
Yeah. And I think they're still very relevant to many people. One of the things that we believe strongly here at Boulderton is that sort of action creates information, that the best thing to do is just to get going and start learning. And I guess PhDs, certainly at institutions which has those kind of resources like well-funded wet labs and great professors, gives the opportunity to create information through action, right? And to test and learn over time. I mean, really, that failure process you went through is the nature of scientific discovery itself. And I guess we'll come a little bit later to how you see that process of scientific discovery changing, in part through the work you're doing at LabGenius. But perhaps you can just give us a little bit of an explanation of then how you made that jump from going through a PhD, being an academic and a researcher, to getting a business formally started.
Yeah, so I think this was a really challenging moment actually in my own personal journey, because you get to the end of the PhD and you want to start a business, but if it's a deep tech business that's really capital intensive, you need access to labs, you need financing, and really all of that takes resources. The challenge for me is I got to the end of that PhD and I had no idea around how to raise money. I had no idea around how to build a business or any of these other pieces. But what was really integral is that as a PhD student who had the opportunity to design my own project and raise a bit of money through sort of grant and charity funding, is I could start applying to bodies like Innovate UK, putting forward grant applications. And really that then became the basis with which I could then go out and raise some dilutive venture money off the back of that.
And in the venture community as a whole and in the startup community, I think often people can overlook how important that first grant funding is, especially government grants or the big charitable or research organizations that will give you non-dilutive capital. Looking back on that, I mean, was that really integral to your success? Institutions like Innovate UK, and are they something you still advocate for? So
Innovate UK actually was really fundamental to getting the business off the ground. And there are a few different reasons for that. The first piece was that you actually learn by writing the grant process. I think before you put the grant application in, maybe you have some interesting technical innovation or idea, but you haven't maybe deeply understood or considered the commercial environment in which that has to exist. And just by writing the grant application, that really forces you to put down in black and white how this thing is going to translate into something that will create value for people. The second piece is that when you put these grant applications in, they get reviewed by these expert assessors. And I was there doing my PhD, putting these grant applications in with the hope that I would then be able to start the business after the PhD. And time again, I would just get these rejected grant applications back. But with every rejection, you kind of learn, okay, you take the feedback and you learn what to do next. Now, when I finally got a grant application accepted, this was this moment where I had this money on the table, but it was entirely fictional in the sense that Innovate UK will only part fund a project. So at that point, that's when I could then go out to private investors and say, hey, look, we've got the scientific idea is being de-risked by these experts. We've got this amount of 70% of the proceeds on the table. We just need that last 30%. And being able to kind of shape the conversation in that way was pretty integral.
And what's your experience like raising private capital initially? Because I guess you sit in between an area of software investment focused on traditional VC, as people might think about it, investing in software and understanding how those iteration cycles work and the kind of product that you want to ship, and life sciences, where people traditionally would fund a molecule and within a particular therapeutic area. And sort of LabGenius really crosses that chasm. Were there people out there who, I guess, first of all, understood what you were trying to do, and secondly, were willing to fund those kind of businesses early on?
Yeah, I would say that when I first started trying to raise money for the business, I had absolutely zero idea around, what venture capital was or how these businesses get financed. So I was, couldn't even understand that there were these buckets of people with these different investment theses. But very quickly, just as you said previously, through that process of getting lots of rejections, you're learning and iterating and growing. I think the thing that became really apparent there is that if you're building a deep tech business like LabGenius, or really if you're doing anything that truly is an emerging and innovative endeavor that sits outside these traditional norms, you've actually got to look for investment theses that match that. So in the case of LabGenius, for that early seed stage funding, the investment thesis that we actually fit into was more the early stage seed investors who were more, I think, founder centric. So it would be the case that they're making a bet on the founder, not necessarily, with a sophisticated idea of what they're trying to do, but they don't necessarily have strict guidelines that they have to adhere to in terms of, is this an asset-centric biotech business or is this a scale in the cloud software as a service business?
And you presumably had to set up some milestones for those early stage investors as well, even though they were backing you, they were backing a vision that you had. But there was a certain amount of capital that you could raise and you were going to deploy that over a certain amount of time. So looking back at that, sort of what were those first milestones that you felt you had to communicate to investors to get them over the line, right? Obviously, they believed in you, they believed in the big vision behind LabGenius, but there were certain things you had to achieve along the way. What were those?
Yeah, it was a really challenging financing process in the sense that you're building a deep tech business. You had this really lofty, ambitious vision for what you want to create. But actually, you're then only able to kind of raise a seed round of a few million to kind of start yourself off on that journey. So exactly as you say, you have to kind of break down the journey into kind of discrete chunks where you can be really confident that if you hit that milestone, there will be some uplift in the company's valuation. Now, for a really deep tech business, often that early stage value inflection point is going to be something that is really deeply technical itself. And so therefore, I think you need an early stage investor who's willing to go on that journey with you and ideally has some pre-existing knowledge of the area. Now, in our case at LabGenius, our seed round was backed by Kindred Capital, and the partner who we work with there was deeply experienced and had been an operator in the genomic space. So, it wasn't a case that we had to try and take an investor up a learning curve. They already sort of intuitively understood the value creating steps for us as an early stage business.
Because it's an interesting process to go through. I always think of venture capital as an incredibly patient asset class, right? Often we don't need to return capital for 10 years, often longer than that, in fact. So in my head, that's a very patient timeline, patient investor. But when you're building something which really is, at the very edges of a tractable technology problem, but really deep tech, it can be a lot longer than that. The timelines are a lot less clear. So even venture sometimes isn't exactly the right fit. So would you recommend really finding those people who've had relevant experience early on? And how much of your, investor base ended up being those people who had relevant experience within the domain, broadly speaking, that you're working in, and those people who trusted your vision?
It's a mixture, and I think you want to have both of those sets of groups, but shape your relationships with them differently. So in the case of the board level interactions, you need everybody around the table in a board meeting to really understand what you're doing. So you don't have to abstract what you're doing into something that then they'll extrapolate from and find that you're actually on a different page to them. So for those board level interactions, I think you need that deep kind of technical sophistication. In terms of building a broader investor base, there's a huge amount of building a business that goes beyond the deep technological aspects, and that could be managing people, thinking through your go-to-market strategy, et cetera. And it's actually, I think, in that broader group that you can really tap into some of those skills. And quite frankly, sometimes it's really helpful just to have somebody in your investor base who can act as a sounding board when you had a really tough day and you just need to kind of ring them up and have maybe a bit of a moan or event. So yeah. I think all of those things are important.
Well, I think there's certainly many things there which are transversal across all businesses, right? Whatever kind of company you're building, there's many skills which hopefully VCs provide and elements of support to founders, but some pretty unique ones to deep tech as well. Going back to that sort of first stage then, you've raised some funding, right? Some of it's Innovate UK initially, and then you have some funding from investors some of whom are domain specific, some of whom are broader than that, and then you're building your team. And I think you mentioned there, right, beyond just getting from 0 to 1 on the technical side, actually there's a lot of team building to be done, a lot of organizational building to be done in the process of scaling a company. How did you think about those first few hires? And in a deeply technical area that you're building in particular, how many of those people had to be very specific scientists and engineers versus people who had more horizontal skill sets?
The initial founding team for the business were really kind of deep technical specialists. So these were people who were deeply trained in synthetic biology. They were people who I really trusted, seen them work, seen them do great work in the lab, and seen their kind of versatility in across a range of different scenarios. So that first early group of people who joined the business, these were all people I knew really well and deeply entrusted. So I think that was a kind of the architecture of the founding team. Now, as the company's grown, and we've gone from not just deeply solving a technical problem, but kind of bringing that to life and then bringing that into the commercial world, the sets of skills and expertise, obviously, that you need in the business grow and change. And of course, as you get more resources, get more notoriety, get more funding, you're able to attract in different folks who can join your business. And so it's been amazing to watch that growth and maturation of the team from a really kind of tight-knit group of deep technical specialists to one where, now we're able to attract in experts from top biotech and pharma companies, top tech companies, and amazing universities as well. Mm.
And I also think as well as you being a great person to work for and the mission being incredibly attractive, I also feel there's a bit of a wave right now of people being interested in working on more meaningful problems. And so giving people an opportunity to do that through a business, I think is really powerful. So hopefully some of that talent is coming through because they're truly passionate about what you're doing, have decided actually if we want to work on massive problems like solving human health in particular through therapeutic antibodies, this is the place to be?
I think that's definitely the case. And I think if you're trying to build a business that is a real deep tech business, it's almost more vocational, right? In the sense that I think any of my team probably could be earning a lot more if they went and joined a business that was purely sort of sticking eyeballs on screens to maximize advertising revenues or whatever that thing is. But to get up day after day and work on a really hard problem, and as I say, you get punched in the gut and have to get up and keep building. This comes from a deep place of understanding the impact that the technology that you're working on has the potential to have. And when it's human health, and we all have friends and family who have been really significantly impacted by health issues, that's the thing that I think motivates me personally. And I know it's the same for the rest of the team as well. Mm.
And maybe we could talk a little bit then about the milestones you're focused on as an organization now, right? You've scaled the organization, you have significant funding, and you've mentioned some of your investors, and you've got some incredible talent. In the sort of relatively near term, what's the focus of the organization, and what does success look like for LabGenius over the next couple of years?
Yeah. So with the funding that we've raised today, what we've been able to do is build a world-leading platform for engineering novel therapeutic antibodies. What we found that this platform enables us to do, and it's something that combines very high throughput experimentation with machine learning, is create molecules that are not only high performing, but those which you would never have found using conventional methods. So really exquisite therapeutics. We now capitalize the business so we can actually take those molecules and start to progress them towards clinical trials, so towards patients. And really that's a massive inflection point for the business, going from a deeply technical platform building activity to one where actually you've been able to prove out what that platform can do and raise enough capital to start progressing the molecules actually towards patients.
But I mean, synthetic antibodies have been used in therapeutics for probably decades now, in some way and shape and form. So what's changed over the last decade, which has meant that your approach to this technology, or your approach to this problem rather, is now viable?
So antibodies, obviously, these are they've been around for millions of years.
Well,
and
antibodies
evolved,
have, yes,
and evolved to obviously stave off infection. Yeah. The next layer on top of that were folks who are engineering these to solve relatively simple problems, in the sense that if I bind to this molecule, maybe I can kind of take it out of circulation and deliver some kind of therapeutic effect. But what synthetic biology allows us to do is to continuously increase the sophistication of those molecules. And you can almost think of it in terms of taking a kind of computational lens of starting to build logic into these molecules. So whilst we call them antibodies as a class of molecules, the sophistication of the logic that you can build into them has got increasingly complex over time. Now, the challenge that comes with that is that as these molecules get more complex, they get harder to engineer. And that's the point at which you need new methods to approach that problem. So the subset of antibody engineering challenges that we focus on at LabGenius are ones where you're trying to engineer molecules that are so complex that you are unlikely to be able to find those molecules using conventional methods. And that's really where the application of machine learning and high throughput experimentation comes into play. Now what you can think about from a kind of therapeutic angle is, as you can create these molecules that are increasingly sophisticated and almost have logic encoded into them, you can start to do more things therapeutically. So the problem space that we're interested in at LabGenius is engineering these molecules so that they can exquisitely differentiate between healthy and disease cells, and then very specifically kill disease cells, which sounds like a pretty fundamental capability that humans should have and should be able to access. But actually, when you look at a lot of the molecules in clinical trials, they really suffer to differentiate between what's a healthy and what's a disease cell. And that's really all of the common side effects that we're really familiar with when you see patients taking some of these therapies, these on-target off-tumor activity that result in, really nasty impacts for patients.
Yeah, I mean, I think I actually read someone talking about novel antibodies as, in particular, engineering them the way you are, is turning a traditional blunderbuss into a laser. Right, and the body has given us this blunderbuss that it can, attack, generally speaking, the right cells, and actually you're turning it into a hyper-focused laser for the types of disease cells that you want to remove, basically. And going back to the problem space, I read a blog that you wrote back in 2018, which I remember being quite controversial at the time, about it's actually beyond human capabilities to think through this problem. Right, the human mind can't deal necessarily with the complexity of this issue, and so we need silicon scientists effectively to solve it. So is LabGenius not only helping us with this shorter term milestone of identifying and perhaps modifying specific antibodies, but actually changing the nature of how we do scientific research.
That's absolutely right. And that's one of the things that really drove me to start the business. And it's kind of an underlying passion of mine, where it feels that it's a tremendous shame if what we can invent in humans is limited by, the extent of our cognition. When you look at the products of evolution, they're infinitely more sophisticated. But using traditional evolution, it's quite a slow process. And so this is where this idea of the silicon scientist sort of came from. And the concept here is that if you want to create any new innovation, new product, new technology, you can actually frame it as a search problem. And if you can frame it as a search problem and collect enough data, you can then build models that are descriptive of the topology of that solution space. So really, this is the idea of this closed loop experimental system that's able to iteratively gain more data about a solution space and ultimately traverse towards a high-performing solution. And what's been fascinating is that I've seen this now play out across multiple different companies in different industries, where we are actually seeing the convergence of, again, high-throughput experimentation with machine learning to really push forward the bounds of human innovation across multiple different domains. So this is something I think is exceptionally exciting and will drive the next frontier of innovation.
And so that interface that really interests me is you're going from sort of the silicon world, in silico software world, right? This very digital and binary experience, through to the real world of experimental scientific research, right? I mean, in the lab, which is messy and complicated and wrought with failure. We've actually got, I think, some assets here of video from your lab and the various different things people are going through. So, I mean, could you walk us through like which part of this scientific process is still possible to be done sort of in silico, and which do you need to have human researchers working on to continue to develop, I guess initially at least, sort of the antibodies?
Yeah, so I guess the first question to start with is why bother building out a lab at all? It's really expensive. Doing stuff in the world of atoms is messy.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of big machines in this.
Lots of
video.
machines, yeah, lots of hard work. The reality is there are some systems that are just fundamentally too complex to model. But if you can build a system in the real world that's able to recapitulate those biologically relevant systems and test them, then you can actually view that as a form of computation itself. This is the physical aspect of a computer. And this is this broader concept of this closed loop experimental platform.
So you're trying to abstract, in a way, you're trying to abstract a lot of the problem into sort of a software space. But actually, you're also saying that software space will extend into the physical world. And how do you make that jump then from what you can do in a cloud server and what can you do with CPU and GPU today, and then what you can do on these machines we're seeing here?
Yeah, so I think where work in the physical domain makes sense is where you have a lot of kind of biological complexity. And so in this case, what we're looking to do is test a large number of different therapies in these very biologically relevant systems that you could never recapitulate from scratch in a computer. But what you can do is, if you collect that data, you can start to model how those systems work in an iterative fashion. Now, the beauty of working on antibodies is obviously antibodies are made of proteins. Proteins are made of strict chains of amino acids. Chains of amino acids can be encoded into DNA, and you can write DNA. So this is the big revolution in being able to not only read DNA, but also to write it. Suddenly means that the actual the biological materials is programmable. And this is why I think as a class of molecules, proteins are absolutely the right one to focus on when you're trying to couple a computational design platform with something that's physically in the real world, because you can go directly from an antibody design to something that's physically perfectly created. So
there's sort of binary we can control in silico in the computer. There's DNA we can control in organics. But then here, if you look at sort of another aspect of your lab, these are atoms. This isn't just DNA being programmed here, right? This is a robotic arm, I believe. So do you extend LabGenius's role all the way through to full lab automation? And if you look at it here, it looks pretty automated. There aren't many humans in this video.
So the big challenge here is, if you want to build one of these closed loop platforms, you can think of the machine learning bit really as just the top of a pyramid. But at the base of that pyramid, what you've got is a lot of novel experimental processes that you've had to develop. You then have to put those on an automated platform, and then you have to ensure that the automated platform can be completely integrated, generate the data. The data then has to be uploaded to the cloud, processed, and then analyzed. So you've got this massive integration challenge of both novel molecular biology processes, physical hardware, software that knits it together, and then the machine learning piece is just that aspect that sits on the top there.
And so one of the things I think a lot of the deep tech founders and companies that we work with have to navigate is then their relationship between these different pieces of the stack and the bits they want to own, the bits that really LabGenius is responsible for, and the bits of innovation they're happy to integrate with. So, when you look at, for example, the machinery in your lab, is LabGenius ever going to extend into operating and owning some of those pieces of machinery, or is your idea that you just build relationships and integrations with the robot arm and with the various other automated machines there?
So what we ultimately care about is what is the fastest way to generate very high quality data. Now, in 99% of instances, that will be a case of if it's on the shelf and it works, we're going to buy it and we're going to integrate it. So a lot of the innovation that we've had to do is around the integration. Now, a challenge has been that a lot of the underlying molecular biology processes don't exist, or they're not fit for generating ML grade data. So there's been a tremendous amount of innovation that we have to do because we can't take a conventional wet lab process because typical wet lab biology was not invented with machine learning in mind. So there's a huge amount of development work there. Physical infrastructure, definitely something that we'll try and plug into. I don't think we'd innovate on the hardware front unless we absolutely had to. But then that software side is another place where we've had to put a lot of effort in because, again, traditionally people are using these machines to kind of run one standalone experiments. For us, what's important is this closed loop experimental platform. And so there's a huge amount of integration challenge there on the software side.
And are you seeing more willingness from the hardware players to integrate and to work with smaller scale software businesses? Because historically that's been one of the challenges, right? People have gone full stack, right? You own the robot arm, there's a lot of pieces of machinery in there you need to get right. Perhaps you don't necessarily want to integrate to a third-party software provider because you may lose some of the value that you're creating as a robot arm producer.
So because the thing that matters most about the LabGenius platform is the end molecules that come out of it, we've seen a huge willingness from different hardware suppliers to come and work with us, to collaborate with us, to have their systems integrated into our architecture. And again, that's partly because I think the more forward-looking robotics manufacturers realized that there is this new wave of computation where integration into the physical world in this kind of closed loop system represents the next frontier for wet lab automation, and they want to be part of that.
And so my aspiration, at least one of the hopes I have, is that these organizations will realize that, in fact, they can grow their market by making wet labs more accessible. And indeed, part of that is automation, right? Because it means that you can do more as a smaller team. And therefore, there'll be more people willing to take the risk to try and build in the wet lab space, try and build in sort of the biologics and biology space. And therefore, hopefully, it's good for them, but also, I hope, inspires more people to be entrepreneurial in this area as well, because access to wet labs becomes easier, automating those wet labs becomes easier, and hopefully, therefore, getting the outputs, whether they're a successful experiment or a failure, becomes easier as well, and you can learn that way.
I think that's right. And I think the other aspect to this as well is we're obviously seeing this huge wave of machine learning coming into wet lab biology. And what you care about if you're generating these proprietary data sets is that you can generate them quickly, that they're large, and the data is very high quality, or at least you understand the inherent noise in the system. Now, you can't generate those data sets using conventional wet lab approaches of, a person wielding a pipette. So actually, the automation is not only just a nice to have, it's integral in being able to create those high quality data sets that you need for the learning.
As well as sort of the hardware players who are in the wet lab space, there's the other angle here, which is the people who are going to ultimately buy and distribute your molecules, your therapeutics, right? Those are the pharma players predominantly. What's your relationship like with those kind of organizations, and how do you think about them? Because a lot of traditional investment in this space has sort of seen them as frenemies, right? You do need to have these phenomenal organizations who invest in R&D and are willing to distribute drugs to get them to patients, to provide those therapeutics. But they haven't always been the best of bedfellows for early stage startups.
LabGenius operates like many biotech companies in the sense that we have this hybrid business model whereby we're investing behind a pipeline of our own molecules, but at the same time we strategically partner with pharma companies where that makes sense. And we've done that very successfully with folks like Sanofi. I think the nuance there is that everyone is acutely aware of the fact that the way in which the scientific discovery process is run is changing. And every pharma company is investing very heavily in their own internal capabilities so they can be at the forefront of this field as well. And when we go into those partnering conversations with pharma companies, sometimes they're very open and sometimes they say, you know what? The reason that we're talking with you is because we want to build a similar capability in-house. And sometimes there is alignment there, and actually there is a nice way to collaborate and move forward. The way in which that can be architected often is we might be pointing our platform to one class of molecules for our own internal pipeline, but we can never take on all of the other opportunities that present themselves. And so by partnering with some of these big players who have really deep expertise in other disease areas, that way often offers a win-win solution whereby we can continue to grow the business in a way that doesn't jeopardize our own internal pipeline.
So the specific therapeutics you're focusing on, you basically take on a case-by-case basis as to whether or not you own or share in some degrees, but it's the platform, the underlying LabGenius platform that you really want to maintain control of and believe that's where presumably the value is in the long run.
Over time, yeah. And I think this is the interesting thing as it sort of plays out in the sense that the market will only really value the molecules, but the value of the business is called a derivative of the platform. So you would expect that if you have a strong underlying technology platform, then over the long term, that should manifest in the pipeline. And the pipeline is the thing that ultimately, I think, a public market investor is going to value.
And so the final, I guess, part of this relationship you have it with the hardware players, you have it with the pharma companies, is the software companies, right? Big software cos. And in the space you're operating in, there's been some huge advances over the last few years. Obviously, AlphaFold, I think, the former CEO of DeepMind, Demis, said is one of the greatest things he's ever worked on, and that's open source some areas of protein development and exploration. And then there's big investments from Google and Microsoft into and Amazon into cloud platforms dedicated for biological and chemical research. So what kind of relationship do you think you have with those big software companies over time? And once again, are these companies which ultimately may be competitors or partners or even owners of LabGenius?
Certainly for the work that we do, we generate these very large proprietary data sets. We also need a lot of compute. And often it's using services like Google Cloud Compute, et cetera, that we can kind of tap into those. I think on the broader kind of generative side, where there's a lot of excitement at the moment, there is also this tension, which is to train these models. Often you need these very large data sets, but in the process of generating the data sets, you can often actually solve the underlying problem that you're you're fundamentally interested in. So I think whilst these generative approaches do have some utility in some of these biological domains, it's not the whole story, and there's a lot of hype at the moment, certainly within that space.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen lots of people suddenly pop up and say, hey, we have an LLM which can solve this particular area of biology. It's incredible. And it does feel like there are emerging capabilities coming to the fore, but always as a mixture of experts approach and alongside other models, but ultimately alongside a lot of understanding of how the process beyond just what a model spits out looks like. Because you can easily say, well, we've reduced the problem space from 100,000 molecules to 10. Getting from 10 to 1 is still a very, very difficult process.
And I think one trend that we are seeing is because there has been a tremendous amount of investment in this kind of generative AI space, we're seeing, honestly, really incredible work on a kind of foundational protein engineering perspective. But not all of that will translate into kind of commercially viable companies. In the sense that these models, these generative models, often they can answer interesting questions, but it may be the case that you can find the same or better answer using conventional methods. And I think for any deep tech company, this is that really interesting question over what is that overlap between the art of the possible and the thing that actually creates kind of commercial value. And that takes not only the kind of the deep technical knowledge, but the understanding of the underlying industry and where value is created.
Yeah, and look, I think what I'm hoping for is that all of this capital that's going into sort of generative AI right now and transformer models does build some interesting businesses, obviously, release some models which ultimately have capabilities which may be unforeseen at the moment, but ultimately overflows into other areas of machine learning and ultimately AI. And the obvious areas that would have the biggest impact is synthetic biology. So it's a great place to be working right now. Maybe we could sort of wrap up and finish with sort of a bigger vision for the company. If you think about what you hope LabGenius creates over the next 5 to 10 years, what are the outcomes that you have obviously been working on and dreaming about for the last decade?
Yeah, so I think the two things that really drive me and motivate me are, one, this kind of deep technical idea of, can we change the way in which the scientific innovation process works? And the second piece is, can we point that capability in an area that's going to have maximal impact for people? And I think over the next 10 years, we have the opportunity to do both of those things through the work we're doing at LabGenius. And through progressing our pipeline, I think we can bring a really transformational change to the way in which diseases like cancer are treated. And then from a deep technical scientific perspective, by proving this out across multiple different programs and scaling what we can do so we can run more programs in parallel, we will change the paradigm of scientific discovery.
I mean, they're two very lofty ambitions. What frustrates you today? What is it that could block you in that process of getting, I guess, better cancer treatments out there, but also giving more people the opportunity to do scientific research through improving and augmenting the existing processes? This is, I think, a challenge that every deep tech founder has. You have the ambition of what you're trying to build, the motivation of why you're trying to build it, but on a day-to-day basis, there's a lot of kind of blocking and tackling and solving of small organizational problems. And I think that's the duality of being a deep tech founder, right? You have, on the one hand, this long time horizon, huge ambition. On the other hand, every day is sort of grunt work. And I think finding a balance and preserving your sanity while you kind of juggle those two pieces is 90% of the work. And if you had a magic wand to change something about the industry in which you're innovating, is there one big thing you think you could change which would massively improve your chances of success? I think more broadly, the thing that would really impact the industry as a whole, not just for LabGenius, is this piece around the funding landscape, which is that, there is this artificial constraint put on businesses to raise capital for this sort of 18 to 24 month period, deliver some kind of milestone that is meaningful, raise at a larger valuation, and sort of rinse and repeat. And that makes sense for a lot of businesses where there is a kind of short feedback time between the innovation and the outcome. I think for some of these longer term deep tech businesses, there's a slightly different story there. And I think one of the things that I've learned is it's around aligning yourself with the pools of capital that do have that longer term time horizon and the ability to continue funding businesses over multiple different years. So I think more of those funds operating here in London in the UK ecosystem can only be a good thing. Look, James, thank you so much for making time to come talk to us on the What Next series. I think that there's not just a huge amount to be excited about in the long run about what you're building, like a fundamental change in not just the way that we can create therapeutics, in particular around oncology and cancer, but also the fundamental process of doing science. And one of the hopes we have for this video series is that discussions with people like you inspire more people to take that risk of starting a deep technology business. And obviously, hopefully one day they'll be using LabGenius assets to improve their own processes. So thank you for doing what you're doing, and thank you for making time with us today. Thanks very much, James.